The movie begins in 1989. Hank Pym arrives at the SHIELD facility to confront Howard Stark, Peggy Carter, and Mitchell Carson over their attempts to replicate his discovery, the Pym particle. Carson remarks on Hank's lack of ferocity in protecting his wife Janet. Hank retaliates by pounding Carson's face onto the table. Hank says that no one will get that formula as long as he is alive, and he doesn't want it to fall into the wrong hands and eventually resigns. Present day, Scott Lang is being punched by an inmate in jail. He hits him back, and then they shake hands as it turns out to be part of their goodbye ritual. Scott is released from prison, and his friend Luis shows up to pick him up, and he arranges a place for Scott to stay. Luis asks for his help with a robbery, but Scott refuses, saying he is not returning to that path, as he has to take care of his daughter. Luis reminds ex-convicts won't get jobs quickly, but Scott is sure he can find one as he got a master's in electrical engineering. Unfortunately, Scott had to settle for a job at Baskin-Robbins. But his manager gets to know about his criminal history and fires him despite being impressed that his crimes are cool. Scott returns to Luis to lament the loss of his job. Luis introduces Scott to Kurt, a tech wizard, and Dave. We learn that Scott blew the whistle 3 years ago that his company was overcharging customers, and they fired him. So Scott hacks into the security system and transfers millions of dollars back to the people, which landed him in jail. At Pym Technologies, Hank returns years after being forced to resign, and the employees are surprised to see him. He reunites with his daughter Hope Van Dyne, who has been distanced from her father since her mother's death. Hank is welcomed by Darren Cross, who now runs the place. Cross invites Hank and associates into a room to reveal his latest invention, the Yellow Jacket, a weaponized suit built on Hank's previous Ant-Man project. It allows the user to shrink to a microscopic size and fight adversaries by utilizing the suit's powers. Cross intends to raise an army of Yellow Jackets in order to build a more sustainable environment. However, a man named Frank seems worried, citing the project as dangerous and wonders what would happen if their enemies got their hands on it. Hank was also horrified as the Yellow Jacket was very close to perfection. Hope asks Hank for the suit so she can finish everything once and for all. Hank refuses by saying it's dangerous and reveals he found a guy for the job. Cross later meets Frank in the toilet and shoots him up with his special gun, transforming him into a ball of slime that he cleans up and flushes down the toilet. Scott shows up unannounced for Cassie's birthday celebration, where she is delighted to see her father and adores the hideous little doll he gives her as a gift. However, her mother's fiancé Paxton is a cop who disapproves of an ex-con arriving there. Maggie, Scott's ex-wife, is also disappointed to see him as he's not paying child support. She tells him to get a place and a job to get visitations with his daughter. In a moment of desperation, Scott goes to Luis and asks about the job. Luis learned from numerous sources that a wealthy old man had a safe containing something valuable. Even though Scott is not sure, he agrees to do the job. The men drive Scott to the house and remain in his ear to assist him. Scott jumps over the fence and disarms the alarm for 20 minutes. He finds a door with a fingerprint scanner and combines various things to create the fingerprint to open it. Beyond the door is a chamber containing the safe, which is old and hard to crack. So Scott cools the metal, causing it to break. Scott is shocked to find no money in the safe but a few blueprints and the actual Ant-Man suit. A tiny ant carrying a camera creeps nearby, filming Scott, and we learn that Hank is watching this whole thing while Scott takes away the suit. At Pym Lab, Cross experiments on a goat to shrink it, but it vaporizes. Scott tried on the outfit and stepped into the bathtub. He shrinks to an insect size as he clicks the button on his right glove. Scott is even more shocked when he hears Hank's voice talking to him through the mask. Luis then enters to take a shower and turns on the water, flooding Scott and forcing him to flee for his life. Scott climbs out of the tub and falls through a hole in the apartment below, where a crowded party is going on. Scott narrowly misses being stomped on before sliding down the vent, where he comes across a mouse much bigger than him. He forces it to fall into a trap and throws himself out of the window, where he returns to regular size after landing on a taxi. Scott sneaks into the house again and returns the suit, only to get caught by the police while leaving. Scott is in his cell when Paxton tells him that Maggie and Cassie will be upset if they learn he got arrested again. Scott is then informed that his lawyer has arrived to see him. Hank appears in the interrogation room, claiming that he was the one who spoke to Scott and that he set it up from the start to get Luis's buddies to tip him off about the safe. Meanwhile, the ants swarm over the camera, obscuring the discussion. Hank condemns Scott's decision to resort to crime when things are going bad. Hank then offers him a chance to fix his life and tells him to wait for further instructions. Many controlled ants deliver the suit to Scott in its miniature size, and they make it big so Scott may quickly slide into it and leave. The police find the cell empty while Scott runs away in his small size. Paxton quickly alerts his team to find Scott, but he manages to leave the building and is surrounded by ants. Hank instructs him to get on the winged ant, which flies him away, but Scott gets dizzy midway and falls off. Scott wakes up in Hank's house to find Hope watching him disappointed. Scott then meets Hank, who reveals that he has been following Scott for a long time since he committed the robbery at the company he worked, and Hank is impressed as Scott beats the most advanced security system, and he knew that Scott could steal his suit. Hank reveals Cross used to be his assistant, and they were close until Cross started to suspect Hank was not telling him everything about the Pym particle, and he gets obsessed with recreating his formula. When Hank didn't help, Cross conspired against him and voted him out of his company. Hank explains why he requires him and how the Ant-Man suit could be dangerous in the wrong hands. Hank persuades Scott to assist him so that he can become a hero to Cassie. Scott claims his days of breaking into places and stealing crap are finished. But Hank wants Scott to hack into Pym Tech in order to steal the Yellow Jacket and delete all the data. Scott proposes they ask the Avengers for help, but Hank has previously refused to cooperate with Howard and isn't willing to let Tony get his hands on this technology. Meanwhile, Cross conducts another experiment with a goat in a glass container, and this time the outcome is successful. Hope gets worried witnessing this. Hope informs Hank that Cross is almost there and they don't have much time. Hope thinks she should use the suit to steal the Yellow Jacket, but Hank refuses. Paxton gets to know Hank Pym is the one who posed as Scott's lawyer. Hank and Hope teach Scott how to operate the suit correctly. He must be quick, agile, and able to communicate with the ants in the same manner as Hank does. Scott repeatedly fails in the beginning until he has a conversation with Hope, who tells him to use Cassie as motivation to bring the ants under control. He then instructs the ants to spin a coin. Scott eventually masters the suit, becomes a leader of the ants, and befriends a flying ant, Antony. Hank eventually addresses Hope about their mother's death. As enemy troops launched a missile against the United States, Hank in his Ant-Man suit and Janet in her Wasp suit intercepted it but could not break inside it and jam it. Janet tampered with her regulator and went subatomic, shrinking herself tiny enough to halt the missile but continuing to shrink into a realm she might not escape. Hank spends the next 10 years researching the quantum realm to bring her mom back, but he cannot find a solution. Hope finally forgives her father. Scott interrupts the moment by remarking on how they are healing their relationship. Scott is assigned with flying to a base to retrieve a particle. When he gets to the location, he learns it is an Avengers base, and they are unaware of it. Scott decides to do it anyway, and he takes Antony to swoops down to land on the roof. Soon after, he meets Falcon, who notices Scott despite his small size and forces him to surrender. They fight, and Scott eventually overpowers him and gains entry to the warehouse. Scott then turns off Falcon's flying pack before escaping from there. Falcon requests that the others not inform Cap about it. Scott returns to Hank, and we learn that he got the particle, and Hank is impressed. Later, Cross pays a visit, so Hank closes the door to hide Scott and Hope. Cross invites Hank to an event on the following evening. He also questions Hank about why he pushed him away while mentoring. Hank claims to have seen too much of himself in Cross. Hank plans to make the theft at the event. Scott claims he can sneak in using the water system, bringing in Luis, Dave, and Kurt, much to Hank and Hope's dismay. The group goes to the event, and Luis slips in as a worker, evading suspicion and lowers the water level, allowing Scott and the ants to enter. Hope uploads the particle to the server so Kurt may access them from the vehicle. Scott then enters the server room, sabotages it, and plants the explosives. Paxton and his partner come across Hank and attempt to arrest him. Dave creates a distraction by taking their car, which allows Hank to enter. He mistakenly honks the horn after returning to the vehicle, which Paxton recognized Scott using earlier. Cross brings Hank and Hope to the Yellow Jacket vault, where we learn that Cross intends to sell them to Hydra. Paxton arrests Dave and Kurt, but Kurt manages to deactivate the laser grid above the Yellow Jacket suit. Scott gets in only to discover that it was a trap set by Cross, who is aware of Scott and Hope's involvement with Hank. Cross tries to kill Hank, but Scott escapes by utilizing some discs Hank gave him, which causes things to blow up. Hank gets shot amid the mayhem, but he survives. Cross make it to the chopper with his suit. Scott pursues him, as Hope remains with Hank. Cross tries to shoot Scott, and strikes Antony mid-flight, to Scott's dismay. He swears he'll make Cross regret it. Hank assures Hope he will not die and shows her the tank keychain from which they escaped the building. Scott gets into the helicopter, and Cross starts shooting at him. When the explosives set by Scott detonate and destroy the whole building, Cross puts on the Yellow Jacket suit and fires lasers at Scott, hitting the pilots. As Scott and Cross shrink, They fall out of the chopper in the briefcase fighting. They land in a family's pool. Scott and Cross continue fighting before Scott hits Cross to fly into a bug zapper. Axton and his partner show up to arrest Scott. On the way back to jail, they hear a commotion at Maggie's residence. Scott is aware that Cross pursued Cassie. We see Cross standing in her room menacingly, keeping her prisoner while Maggie is out there helpless. Scott makes Cross shrink, and they fight all around the room. Axton runs to the room to protect Cassie. Cross aims his lasers at them while Scott tries to break into the Yellow Jacket. But the titanium is too strong for him to break into, so he decides to go subatomic despite Hank's warnings. Scott shrinks to a small enough size to break into Cross's suit and sabotages it, causing it to kill him. Scott lands in a subatomic and disappears into a state of oblivion. Scott is floating in subatomic space when he hears Cassie's calling for him. He inserts a disc in the reactor, helping him return to regular size, and they embrace. Hank asks Scott how he escaped subatomic space and wonders whether Janet could have done the same. He then happens to catch Scott and Hope kissing. Scott later enjoys dinner with Cassie, Paxton, and Maggie. Paxton lets Scott off and covers for him to thank him for his bravery. After that, they see a video of Cassie performing her first cartwheel. Scott meets Luis, who informs him that he got a tip that Falcon is looking for someone with specialized talents. Hank takes Hope to his lab. He shows her the advanced prototype Wasp suit that he and Janet designed. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe, and turn on notifications to watch more videos like this.